The case ledger of Otto Heinrich Brenner, licensed dental practitioner of the city of Vienna, is stored today in a wooden box on the fourth shelf of the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv's Medical Collections Annex, filed under Rural Practitioner Records, 1870s to 1890s. The box has no catalogue entry. It was donated in 1931 by Brenner's granddaughter, who described its contents in an accompanying letter as professional papers of no particular interest. The archivist who received the donation filed it without examination. No researcher requested access to it for 62 years. In 1993, a doctoral candidate in the history of medicine named Elsa Feuerbach opened the box while searching for evidence of rural anesthetic practices on the Carpathian circuit, and found among the ledger pages a folded sheet of paper tucked between the binding and the back cover. She photographed it. She did not publish it. She mentioned it in a single footnote in a dissertation that was accepted and then shelved. The footnote reads, "One anomalous entry in the Brenner ledger, dated the 14th of March, 1882, warrants further examination. Clinical notes are absent. The patient identifier has been removed by abrasion." A folded sheet found in the binding contains a sketch and 3 lines of text. The sketch has not been identified. That sketch is what this investigation concerns. If this record has your attention, and if you want to know what the sketch contained and what those 3 lines of text said, and why Elsa Feuerbach chose a footnote rather than a chapter, subscribe to this channel before you continue. The documents that surface through this kind of work do not stay available. The boxes get relabeled, the footnotes get trimmed, the dissertations go unread. Subscribe now so the next investigation reaches you when it appears. Otto Heinrich Brenner was born in Vienna in 1844. He trained at the Imperial Dental Institute under Professor Carla Bruck between 1862 and 1866, and was licensed in the spring of 1867. He did not open a fixed practice. This was not unusual for a man of his temperament and modest means. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1870s and 80s contained a vast rural population with almost no access to professional dental care, and the state had for some years encouraged trained practitioners to take up traveling circuits, moving village to village on a seasonal route, treating patients who could pay and sometimes those who could not. Brenner took up a circuit in the autumn of 1868 that ran south and east from Vienna through the hill country of Lower Austria and into the uplands of Bohemia and Moravia. He travelled by cart. He carried his instruments in a leather case the size of a small trunk. He kept meticulous records. The ledger that survives covers 14 years of practice, from 1868 to 1882. It contains 4,211 individual patient entries. Each entry follows the same format: the date, the village or town, the patient's surname and initial, the work performed, the materials used, and the fee charged or waived. Brenner's hand is small and consistent throughout. He does not editorialize. He does not describe patients beyond their dental condition. The ledger, read from first page to last, gives the impression of a man who lived almost entirely inside procedure. The entry for the 14th of March 1882 is not that man. The village Brenner was visiting on that date was called Hrotovice, a market settlement of perhaps 300 people in the Moravian uplands, approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Brno. He had passed through it twice before on his circuit, in 1874 when he treated 6 patients, and in 1878 when he treated 4. Both visits appear in the ledger in standard form. The entries name patients, describe procedures, record fees. On the 14th of March 1882, the ledger records 7 patients before the anomalous entry. All 7 follow the standard format. The 8th entry, the last of that day, contains a date and a location, written only as the Mill Road Eastern End, and a fee. The fee is recorded as 0, waived. The section where a patient's surname and initial should appear has been abraded from the paper. The fibre of the page is faintly roughened in that spot, and on the reverse side, where ink typically bleeds through, the surface has been treated with the same fine-grained abrasive, both sides. The clinical notes section, where Brenner would ordinarily have recorded what work he performed and with what materials, is blank. Brenner waived his fee 19 times across 14 years of practice. The ledger records the reason in every other instance: a note of destitution, old age, charity extended to a known family. This entry carries no such note, and of 4,211 patient entries in that ledger, this is the only one in which the clinical record was deliberately removed. The folded sheet tucked into the binding was not cut from the ledger. It is a different paper, heavier stock, slightly yellowed, folded 4 times into a compact rectangle, small enough to sit behind the spine without disturbing the sewn gatherings. When Feuerbach unfolded it in 1993, she found a pencil sketch on one side and 3 lines of writing on the other, all in Brenner's hand. The sketch takes up most of the page. It shows a dental cross-section drawn with the precision of a trained clinician, depicting the upper left quadrant of a jaw. The roots of the teeth extend to the very bottom of the page. Feuerbach estimated in her footnote that if drawn to scale, the root length of the second and third molars represented approximately 4.5 inches from gum line to apex. A human molar root averages between 1 3/4 and 2.5 inches. The crowns in the sketch are broad and intact. There is no decay marked anywhere. The enamel, as Brenner indicated with a hatching pattern his other clinical sketches used to denote dense material, appears substantially thicker than anything he had drawn before in 14 years of working mouths. In the lower right of the page, marked with a small circled arrow, Brenner had drawn a detail on the interior face of the second upper molar. It is small, perhaps 1/4 of an inch across in the original. It is a tree. The roots and the branches of that tree are perfectly mirrored, so that the image turned upside down does not change. On the reverse of the sketch, in Brenner's same small hand, are 3 lines of writing. They are not a clinical note. They are not addressed to anyone. They read in translation from the German as follows: height by chair measurement 9 feet and 2 inches, seated, standing not possible to determine. Brought by a woman in dark cloth who spoke only Czech. She said, "Do not put this in the book," and then a 3rd line that is not a sentence. It is a phonetic transcription, spelled out in Roman characters, of a word Brenner heard and could not place. Beneath the transcription he drew the word again, or tried to. What he drew was not letters, it was a shape. The same shape that appears on the molar in the sketch on the other side of the page. The mirrored tree, roots and branches identical, the image that does not change when turned upside down. He heard it spoken, he wrote it down. He did not know what language it belonged to, or what the word meant, or whether it was a word at all and not a name. He simply recorded it the way a careful man records what he cannot explain, and then he folded the paper and hid it. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The woman who brought the patient to the mill road on the eastern edge of Hrotovice on the evening of the 14th of March, 1882, is not named anywhere in Brenner's surviving papers. She wore dark cloth. She spoke Czech with what Brenner, in the letter he wrote 2 weeks later to his former teacher, Professor Karl Bruck, at the Imperial Dental Institute in Vienna, described as the accent of an older region, by which he meant not the speech of a young woman or a city woman, but something older in the construction of the vowels, as though the Czech she spoke had been learned from documents rather than from childhood. She paid him in silver. The coins, Brenner noted, were of a denomination he did not recognize. When he looked at them afterward, back in his lodgings, he found they bore a date that placed them 40 years before the Empire's current currency reform. The coins should not have been in circulation. He did not spend them, he kept them in his instrument case. They are not in the archive box. At some point between 1882 and 1931, they disappeared. The mill itself on the eastern road at Hrotovice was not a working mill in 1882. It had been disused since approximately 1860. A regional property survey from 1871 shows it passed out of the estate of a local miller into the ownership of an unnamed buyer registered in BRNO, and after that the property record becomes unusually thin, a single renewal of title in 1878, no name recorded. The entry signed only by a notary whose office in BRNO closed the following year. The building was still standing during a regional photographic survey conducted in 1912. The photograph shows a stone structure of substantial size, the ground floor windows low, unusually low, as though the floor level inside sat well below the surrounding ground, and the door openings, which the surveyor noted in his accompanying report as having been recently fitted with new timber frames, were cut into the stone at a height he estimated at between 10 and 11 feet. The new timber frames were several feet shorter. Someone had built down inside the original openings rather than fill them to the original height. What Brenner treated that evening was a single tooth. The sketch is unambiguous on this point. The fracture line running vertically through the second upper molar, from crown face to root apex, through 4.5 inches of enamel, dentine, and cementum, is the kind of split produced by an impact force far beyond anything the human masticatory system generates. It was not decay. It was not age. Something had struck that tooth, or something that tooth had bitten had struck back, with force sufficient to split it longitudinally without dislodging it from the jaw. The tooth was still seated, both halves were still present. The root structure as drawn was intact on both sides of the fracture. The repair Brenner would have performed is standard in the context of his training and his period. A fine gold wire ligature drawn around the fractured crown to hold the halves together, the split packed with gutta percha softened in warm water, pressed into the gap and allowed to set, the bite surface smoothed with a small file. He had done this procedure on human teeth in ordinary mouths many times. The ledger records 9 such repairs in 14 years of practice. He knew the instruments required, the time the procedure took, and the pressure needed to work the wire without cracking the crown further. He performed all of this in the lower room of a disused mill in the uplands of Moravia on an evening in March, by lamplight, on a jaw that his sketch suggests was approximately twice the width of any jaw he had drawn before. 2 weeks after that evening he wrote to Professor Bruck. The letter is in the archive box. It describes in careful clinical language the root depth, the tooth dimensions, and the enamel density he observed, without naming the patient or the location. He asked Bruck whether any case in the literature documented root lengths of this order, tooth enamel of this thickness, or a jaw architecture consistent with the proportions in his enclosed sketch. He enclosed a copy of the sketch. He did not enclose the 3 lines of text on the reverse. Bruck's reply is also in the box. It is 4 sentences. Bruck wrote that he had encountered nothing of this kind in the literature. He wrote that the sketch was anatomically implausible. He wrote that he assumed Brenner had been deceived by an unusual patient, possibly one with a pathological condition of the jaw, and that the visual distortion of lamplight in an unfamiliar space could account for the apparent dimensions. The final sentence reads, "I would advise you to make no further record of this matter." Brenner kept both letters. He kept the original sketch with the 3 lines of text still on its reverse. He kept all of it inside the back binding of the ledger he carried for the remaining months of his circuit, and then brought home to Vienna in April of 1882, the last April of his travelling practice. He never returned to the Moravian circuit. He never took another rural posting. There is one more document in the box. It is an envelope, unsealed, empty. The letter that was once inside it is gone. The envelope is addressed in Brenner's hand to a street in the Malastrana district of Prague. The building on that street, as it appears in the Prague Property Register for 1882, was registered to a religious order. The registration lists the order by name. It is the Order of St. Clare. Brenner died in Vienna in 1911 at the age of 66, in a rented room near the Ringstrasse. He had never married. The private surgery where he worked for nearly 30 years recorded his death in their employment register with a single line, O.H. Brenner, ceased. No obituary appeared in the Vienna papers. No death notice survives in the records of the Imperial Dental Institute. He left the record the way a man leaves a room when no one is watching the door. When Elsa Feuerbach travelled to the Prague address in 1994, she found a building that had been converted to a municipal records office in 1948. The front desk told her it had been a convent before the war, then a private residence, then a government office. The original chapel was still intact on the ground floor, sealed and used for storage. She asked to see it. The key, she was told, had been lost. She noted in a personal journal, not the dissertation, a separate notebook, that the door to the sealed chapel was 11 feet tall, and that the stone frame around it had never been narrowed. She did not publish this observation. The journal passed to a colleague after her death in 2007. The colleague has since retired. The detail from Brenner's sketch that no researcher has accounted for is in the lower left corner of the page below the cross-section, where Brenner made a second small drawing. It was not circled. It carries no annotation. It shows a hand drawn from above, palm down, fingers extended. Beside the longest finger, Brenner wrote one measurement, 9 inches. That is the width of one finger. He drew it and folded the paper and pressed it behind the binding, and no one opened that binding for 62 years, and the woman who finally did chose a footnote and then went quiet. And now the number sits in front of you the same way it sat in front of her, with no unit of ordinary human anatomy large enough to contain it. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.